for urging me to occupy my writing, and to all my workshop leaders and peers. Infinite gratitude to my incredible friends here, including Liz, who is my very first friend at BCFA. I'm honored to read with you and Joe. Thanks to those who aren't here, my parents who have been endlessly supportive, particularly since I'm the only one in the family who's not a lawyer, my beloved twin brother Dan, who live texts his reactions to my drafts, and to Simon, my editor, partner, and best friend. An extra thank you to Sarah Fro for taming the Jufro today. And speaking of Jufro, my story has a few Yiddish and Hebrew phrases, so I thought I'd start off with a quick glossary. Baruch Hashem is Hebrew for praise the Lord, so I'm about to graduate from BCFA, Baruch Hashem. Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year. It's in September usually, and treif is anything that's not kosher, so delicious food like shellfish, bacon, cheeseburgers. This is a condensed version of a story called Prodigal. Ezra had always been a seeker. That's how his parents put it to their friends anyway, explaining away why he'd been kicked out of college after a Native American rights sit-in, why he had lived under the redwoods confronting loggers, why he'd been arrested during the anti-globalization demonstrations, a black bandana tied across his face with baby fat still clinging to its cheek. Even as a child, his father Harry said, Ezra had staged nonviolent direct actions, refusing to leave the top of the playground slide unless the other children agreed to stop cutting the line. At age 10, he and his friend Rena got African American history added to the 5th grade curriculum. Ezra gave up the daredevil activism they began to believe after he sat Shiva for Rena, his spidery legs too big for the couch in a living room of weeping relatives. It was a week after his 23rd birthday. He hatched a plan to take a birthright Israel trip. Just to test his beliefs, he told them. Just to get away, he told them. And at first, he reported days at the beach and expeditions to dance clubs and archaeological sites. He claimed to be at peace. The return ticket got pushed back and pushed back again. But then the polemics began about preserving the vitality of the homeland, about the world being against us, about the Jews of the world abandoning God. He had met a rabbi, my teacher, Ezra said, and he announced a new phase of his trip to learn with this holy man. His beard grew out, his clothing grew medieval, his return date indefinite. To Harry, to his father, Israel felt more unsafe than the redwoods, further away than a jail cell in Seattle. Maybe it felt so because a child, a woman, yes, but a child to them, was dead. Because Israel was scarred with craters and shrapnel and fear. Because Harry and Cynthia were so tired of worrying about Ezra. And also petrified that someday something would happen and they'd never have to worry about Ezra again. Harry's 2 other children debated their brother frequently. He's joined a cult, Jeremy said. What can we do? He sounds like he believes in the, rabbi stuff. Dahlia, the middle child, the mediator, would always reply. But now, Ezra had announced his impending arrival home for Rosh Hashanah. Even better, he had someone for them to meet. A match set up by their rabbi, according to the information his siblings gleaned over the internet. A girl named Hannah, an American who had made Aliyah, who had made Israel her home forever. It was hardly possible to prepare for Rosh Hashanah in the usual manner when your son was due in a few hours with a strange Zionist he planned to marry. To a visitor, Harry and Cynthia would have seemed all authoritative bustle. Only to each other were the signs visible, a slowness in her step, the dropped angle of his head, an old bottle of blueberry jam on the table instead of the honey. The new year, their new year, had come too early. Only last week they'd been up at the place they rented in Maine, flashing tan skin, slipping into the icy Atlantic. If it weren't for the holiday, Harry thought, you might have gone on, oblivious for another week or two, imagining it was still summer, and your son was not about to announce his engagement to a stranger in a kerchief. As they prepared the meal, Harry felt the sweat stains spreading in his armpits. Cynthia and Harry were fine with the girl sharing Ezra's bedroom, but the couple might object on religious grounds. But on the other hand, would putting her in the guest room right away seem hostile and so hasten Ezra's embrace of her? They should start with a long engagement. There's nothing wrong with a long engagement, said Cynthia. Not when you're not allowed to touch each other, said Harry. The women stood at the counter, their slim shoulders moving in sync as they chopped vegetables. Are you sure your hands are kosher? Harry joked, hovering behind them. Dahlia, of course, had been the dietary supervisor for the meal. Keeping kosher had never mattered to them. Lobster had been half the reason for their summer trips to Maine. With bare hands, they'd torn into the trace, buttery and soft beneath the brittle shells. And the cheeseburgers, the hundreds and hundreds of cheeseburgers they'd eaten at Yankees games as a family, as a father and son. It was true that at home, Cynthia didn't like to keep bacon or shrimp around. That taboo lived, neither on purpose nor spoken, more instinctive, primal, some ghost looking over her shoulder. Had they done wrong there? Should they have spoken more about their views on God and prayer and ritual and marriage and death? What were their views? Harry supposed they were a very conventional family. Certainly that idea had comprised the major thrust of Ezra's previous rants. Harry walked to the liquor store on the corner. His eyes scanned over the rows of wine in the kosher section, cylinder after cylinder, dark and shiny. Away from the family, he felt an urge to smash them, to watch the glass and wine spread and soak into the carpet. An hour before sunset, the couple walked in the door. Immediately, Harry's son was in the clutches of his siblings who, despite all the anger and the fear, had attacked their brother with hugs like frisky animals, like they used to. Harry had seen the pictures of Ezra in the dark coat and hat at the ultra-Orthodox, and yet in person, this man with his bushy beard spilling out, his tight ringlets dangling over each ear, felt more foreign and also more familiar. A layer of bulk had grown around Ezra. The boniness Harry had long thought integral to his son's physique had been swallowed up in folds of flesh and fabric. But he was Ezra, the center of his family's thoughts since he left, sowing discord and concern and drawing in their love to spite it, because of it. And he was home. In a booming tone his father did not quite recognize, Ezra introduced her. "This is my Hannah." Harry reached out to shake the girl's hand, but she held her own hand up and gave him a little wave. Right, no touching. Her face was hard to judge beneath her thick, smooth makeup. She wore a 3/4 length skirt, a long-sleeved sweater, leather pumps, and the determined air of Caesar crossing the Alps. Where was the softness, the sincerity? She scared Harry, but possibly she was scared herself. As they sat in the living room, Hannah's eyes narrowed, her mouth set itself in a thin line. She cleared her throat and tapped her intended on his arm. "Ezra," she said, "I think before dinner begins, we should talk a bit with your family." "Oh yes, of course, Hamala," said Ezra, a stilted rhythm to his speech. We have a few things to clear up, a few official announcements. Since we're going to be here for the week, Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Harry grabbed Cynthia's hand, and he noticed Jeremy and Dahlia glance at each other. Baruch Hashem? Had God enabled them to stay for the week, or was it just their parents' hospitality? Cynthia, ever practical, stepped in. "If we're clearing things up, your father and I have been unsure about where you want to sleep. Separate rooms, of course," said Hannah, her voice like steel. "Right," said Ezra. "About the food, we brought paper plates and utensils so we can keep fully kosher. We just wanted you to let you know and tell you please not to be uncomfortable." The plates? Cynthia's good plates weren't good enough? But rapidly, Harry's anger switched to understanding. They should have thought about the plates. They should have thought about the plates, not just the food. It hadn't even occurred to them, or perhaps they hadn't wanted to think, that the plates Ezra had eaten from for 2 decades were now abhorrent, unclean. "We have paper plates too," said Cynthia. Harry wondered if they really did. Hannah tapped one sharp-toed pump. "They don't mind about our plates," she said. "Let's continue on. Remember what the rabbi said." "Sorry," said Ezra. "It's just that this is awkward. As I said, we have a very particular announcement and a card to go with it for you, Mom." Cynthia jerked backwards and then caught herself and looked searchingly at her son. He didn't meet her eyes. She said, "I'm thrilled, but please, let's save it for after dinner. I'm sure we have a lot to talk about on all sides, but for now I have chicken. Dahlia, help me." Harry tightened his hold on her hand, even though he knew she would be getting up momentarily. Surely now was the moment to plead for the long engagement. "Please," Cynthia said, and he heard begging in her voice. Was it for Ezra or for him? Let's just savor the meal. We haven't been together for so long." Hannah pursed her lips, but joined them at the table. She slid paper plates over her and Ezra's places, a considerate gesture in a way. Around the table, they asked the couple about their flight and Hannah's excitement at visiting New York and the whereabouts of classmates and friends. As he answered their questions, Ezra's vocal affectations, his fiddler on the roof meets Israeli army accent, faded. Harry felt the others in the room relax. See, he's still Ezra. "Did you hear there's a new headmaster at school?" asked Jeremy. "No," Ezra responded, leaning forward. "No idea. What else can you tell me about high school people?" There was plenty to relate. This do-gooder classmate of Ezra's was in rehab. That homely teacher had finally gotten married. His children egged each other on to report. They added more and more humor, more and more exaggeration. Jeremy used the word bullshit, and Ezra echoed it. To Hannah's apparent forbearance, swearing was permitted by the rabbi, Harry guessed. Cracker spewed out of Ezra's mouth. He turned to Hannah to translate to her, explaining who this person was, what this joke meant. He was kind of an innocent, wasn't he, when he wasn't being a pedantic ass, thought his father. He made the girl laugh underneath her headgear. Maybe she did love him. They reminisced about the caterpillar farm they created on the sun-baked stones behind the main house. The huge lobster with the yellow rubber bands on its claws they'd seen skimming across the bottom of a tide pool. Eventually, Ezra began to forget to clue Hannah in. He started rocking back and forth on the chair as though he was praying. Jeremy's face turned red. Cynthia actually grinned. Harry recognized the paradox of Ezra, his magnetism, his warmth, despite the lectures and everything about him that infuriated them. It felt so good, Harry thought, to have the family together this way. Cynthia had been right to delay confrontation for after the meal. A mellowness spread from the wine at his lips to his chest and head, pushing away the disquietude. They spoke of more sober topics: Harry's Uncle Joe at the nursing home, Dahlia's plans to take the bar exam, Jeremy's difficult client. Ezra paused and then asked the final question. "How's Rena's family doing anyway?" he asked. "It's been a year. Have you seen them?" "They stopped returning our calls," said Cynthia. "It's hard." The table that had been overwhelmed by chatter fell into silence. A cool wind blew in through the window. Harry cleared his throat. He remembered what he'd said to Ezra before his son left for Israel. "I never want to live to see parents bury their child again," as they'd embraced hard, that shared wish papering over all the arguments, the chasms between them. Dessert came out and they piled their plates with honey cake. Jeremy put the kettle on for tea. "Well, we can't delay it any longer. We wrote you a card, Mom," said Ezra, his voice now soft and low. "We love you, Mom," read Cynthia, dutiful, as she opened it, "from your son Ezra, and your very soon-to-be daughter-in-law, Hannah." Her face lost some color, but she smiled again. "I know, dear, I know. But how soon? Your father and I hope you won't jump into anything too fast. We really did want to discuss that with you this week." This time she reached out to Harry. He found his pulse elevated, his throat constricted. Cynthia had gone into the breach. He had to follow her to doom and make a go of staving this off. "Well, what are you two youngsters planning?" Harry asked. "We might as well talk about it." Ezra, to his credit, seemed embarrassed. "Well, our rabbi feels we are ready to unite ourselves before God. He doesn't want us to wait too long. So we're going to have a ceremony for our families in December, as soon as you can get away." "We don't care about having a big bash," he said. "You know how I feel about materialism." Harry flushed, remembering the years of being called a corporate shill, a bourgeois property lover. At least Ezra had remained consistent on that score. "We just care about following God's path for us," Hannah piped in. "And after the wedding, we're going to have a family, right away. It's what we want. It's part of why we're so right for each other." "A child," said Cynthia. "A child. That's a lovely thought, but you're both so young." "For our community, we're actually getting to be over the hill," said Hannah with a laugh. Harry guessed what Cynthia was thinking when she said "a child" in that wistful tone. He had a vision of a child who wouldn't know summers in Maine, a child who wouldn't know the Yankees, who would never taste lobster, a child who wouldn't even have Ezra's lingering attachments to their family, whose threads and ties would instead be to Israel, to women as helpmeet, to the desert, the army all around him with its tan, hard faces, the mentality of a people under siege, a people laying siege, a place with the threat of death looming in every marketplace, on every bus, everywhere. But of course, death was everywhere. Hannah's face wore a radiant defiance, Ezra's a mixture of smugness and concern. "Look, we're determined. And I know you all always wanted me to be normal and to settle down," he said. His voice was remote and pained. "So I hope the marriage, the baby, fatherhood, I hope that makes you happy, at least." "Oh, Ezra, we never wanted anything except what made you happy," said Cynthia, her face contorted with the effort of not breaking down. "Why would you say a thing like that to your mother?" Harry said, but he felt his own anger and defensiveness die even as he spoke the words, tension exhaling from him like a sigh. Until that moment, Harry realized he had clung harder than he thought to the slim hope that his son would be normal someday, that like his siblings, he'd be in the Northeast, within easy reach, married to someone who saw things more or less the way they did. They'd have all the holidays together and argue and laugh. He felt his lips tremble. Jeremy crossed his arms and asked if it all wasn't a little too fast. Dahlia burst into tears and said sorry, but she was crying because she was so happy for her baby brother. Harry and Cynthia stopped speaking and held hands under the table. They would get the toasts ready in a moment and the smiling faces. What else could they do? What else had they ever been able to do with Ezra? And also in spite of themselves, now they were sharing the sensation of loss and gain, of a year ending and another one beginning, of the dying away of one dream for their own child, and the birth of a reluctant love, a love laced with pain, a love they didn't want to feel, already growing in their hearts for the child that was soon to be.